Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. If you've found your way here tonight, you're probably ready to slow down, to let the day go, to settle in and let your mind wander somewhere quiet and unhurried. That's exactly where we're going. Each episode, we spend time with the life of a real person from history, someone whose story is worth sitting with, someone whose world was slower and quieter than the one we move through every day. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with Queen Charlotte. She was a queen of Great Britain and Ireland for more than 50 years. A wife, a mother, a patron of music and the arts. A woman who arrived in a foreign country at the age of 17 and never quite stopped finding her way within it. There's something I find quietly moving about her story, not because it was dramatic, though parts of it were difficult, but because of the steadiness she maintained through so much of it. A life spent mostly in private, mostly in duty, mostly in a world not entirely of her own choosing. I find that it's the kind of life that reveals more the longer you sit with it. So let's begin. Charlotte was born on the 19th of May, 1744. Her full name was Sophia Charlotte, and she came into the world in a small German duchy called Mecklenburg-Strelitz. It was a quiet, modest place, a small territory in what is now northeastern Germany. Not a grand kingdom, not one of the great powers of Europe, just a small and relatively peaceful corner of the continent, tucked between larger and more powerful neighbors. Her father was Duke Charles Louis Frederick of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Her mother was Princess Elizabeth Albertine of Saxe-Hildburghausen. Charlotte was one of their younger children in a large family. By the time she was 8 years old, her father had died. She was raised largely by her mother, and later under the care of her eldest brother, who inherited the duchy. Life in Mecklenburg-Strelitz was modest by royal standards. The court was small, the ceremonies were quieter, the world was narrower, but Charlotte was given a solid education. She learned French as most young noblewomen of her era did. She studied music. She developed a love of botany that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She was curious by nature, thoughtful. She read widely, and she took her studies seriously. Those who knew her in childhood described a young woman who was attentive and earnest, not flamboyant, not seeking attention, but quietly present in whatever she turned her mind to. It was a calm upbringing in many ways, sheltered, small in scale, and it could not have prepared her fully for what was coming. Because in 1761, when Charlotte was 17 years old, her life changed entirely. King George III of Great Britain was 23 years old and newly on the throne. He needed a queen. His advisors and courtiers had been searching for a suitable Protestant bride from among the noble families of Europe. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was chosen. She was not the most obvious choice. Her duchy was small. She was not widely known in European courts. But she was Protestant. She was young. She was said to be of good character and good health. And so the decision was made. Charlotte would leave everything she had ever known. She would travel to England. She would marry the king. She had no say in any of it, of course. That was simply how things worked for young women of noble birth in the 18th century. Marriage was arrangement. Marriage was duty. Marriage was a contract between families and between nations. And so, in September of 1761, Charlotte boarded a ship and sailed for England. The crossing was not an easy one. The North Sea was rough. The journey took longer than expected. Charlotte was seasick and frightened. She was surrounded by strangers. She was traveling away from her home, her language, her family, toward a country and a king she had never met. She is said to have coped with it by playing her harpsichord on the ship, by keeping herself occupied with music when the anxiety became too much to sit with quietly. It's a small detail, but it tells you something about her. She arrived in England on the 7th of September, 1761. She was met by members of the royal household and immediately brought toward London. Within hours of setting foot on English soil, she was introduced to King George III for the first time. They were married that same evening. It's almost impossible now to imagine the pace of it. To arrive in a foreign country after a difficult sea crossing, to meet your future husband for the first time, and to be married to him within the same day. But that was Charlotte's introduction to her new life. By all accounts, George was kind to her. He was a serious, conscientious young man, not given to extravagance or excess. He valued duty and simplicity. In many ways, those qualities matched Charlotte's own. They were a well-matched pair in temperament, if not by prior acquaintance. Just 2 weeks after their marriage, Charlotte was crowned Queen of Great Britain and Ireland at Westminster Abbey. She had been in England for barely a fortnight. The years that followed settled into a rhythm. Charlotte and George made their primary home at Buckingham House, which was then a much more modest residence than the palace it would later become. George purchased it for Charlotte as a private retreat from the larger court at St. James's Palace. It became known for a time as the Queen's House. They also spent a great deal of time at Windsor, and later they would become particularly attached to Kew, where Charlotte could indulge her love of botany in the gardens there. Their life together in those early years was relatively quiet. George was serious and industrious. Charlotte was private and diligent. They were not a couple who sought spectacle. They had children, many children, 15 in total, of whom 13 survived into adulthood. It was one of the largest royal families Britain had seen in generations. Charlotte bore her first child, the future King George IV, in August of 1762, less than a year after her marriage. She was 18 years old. The children kept coming steadily over the years that followed. A son, then a daughter, then another son. The nursery at Buckingham House grew busy and full. Charlotte was closely involved in the upbringing of her children. She oversaw their education, their routines, their care. She was not an especially warm mother by the standards of her age or ours. She was more formal than tender, more concerned with duty and correctness than with ease or warmth. But she was present. She was engaged. She took seriously her role in shaping her children's characters. George was the same. He valued simplicity and virtue. He wanted his children to be educated, disciplined, and aware of their responsibilities. He and Charlotte shared that vision, and they worked to instill it. The court life Charlotte entered was formal and demanding. Her days were structured around ritual and duty, rising at a set hour, receiving visitors, attending ceremonies, hosting events, moving through the elaborate choreography of royal life in the Georgian era. She learned English. She worked at it seriously and steadily. Her accent never fully disappeared, and in her early years in England, she struggled with the language. But she applied herself, as she applied herself to most things. She also continued her music. George himself was musical, and they shared that interest. Their court became known as a place of genuine musical appreciation. Charlotte was an accomplished keyboard player, and she had a particular fondness for the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. In her early years in Britain, she became closely connected with Johann Christian Bach, one of the sons of Johann Sebastian Bach, who served as her music master. What is clear is that Charlotte maintained a lifelong connection to serious music. Her other great love remained botany. She took a deep interest in the gardens at Kew, which grew in ambition and scope over the decades she and George were associated with them. She collected botanical specimens. She corresponded with naturalists. She gave her name to a plant, the Strelitzia, also known as the bird of paradise flower. That quiet, vivid bloom carries her name still. These were the things that gave Charlotte something of her own. In a life defined largely by duty and role, music and nature were places where her own interests could breathe. The early years of her marriage, though busy and unfamiliar, were in many ways the most stable she would know, because in time, the shadows would begin to gather. George, as the years passed, began to show signs of something troubling. His behavior, at intervals, became erratic. He spoke rapidly and without pause. He grew agitated or confused. At times, he seemed not fully himself. Charlotte was among the first to witness this privately. Before the wider world knew anything was wrong, she was navigating it within the walls of their home. But that part of the story belongs to the years ahead. For now, in the early years of the 1760s and into the 1770s, life had a shape and a rhythm. Charlotte fulfilled her duties. She raised her children. She attended to the court. She found her small pleasures in music and gardens. And she settled, as best she could, into the life that had been chosen for her. She was young. She was far from home. She was queen of a large and complicated country she had not grown up knowing. But she adapted, quietly and steadily. She adapted. That, perhaps, is the quality that defines her more than any other. Not brilliance, not power, not a dramatic story of triumph or rebellion, but a quiet, steady, persistent adaptation to a life that asked a great deal of her, and that life was only just beginning. As the 1760s moved into the 1770s, Charlotte's life took on a familiar shape. There were seasons at Windsor, seasons at Kew, the steady rhythm of court life, of public appearances, of private evenings in the Queen's house at Buckingham. George and Charlotte were not a glamorous couple by the standards of European royalty. They did not host the most extravagant parties. They did not chase spectacle or excess. What they had instead was routine. And in that routine, there was something genuine. George was faithful to Charlotte. That, in an era when royal infidelity was common and often openly accepted, was not a small thing. He seems to have genuinely valued her company. They shared their interests in music, in nature, in the quiet pleasures of domestic life. They read together. They walked in the gardens at Kew together. For Charlotte, this must have mattered. She had arrived in England as a stranger. She had married a man she had never met. And yet, in time, something that resembled a real partnership had taken shape between them. Oh, it was not always easy. George's temperament could be rigid and demanding. He had strong opinions about how things should be done and was not always easy to live with. Charlotte learned to move carefully around his moods and his principles, but she was not without her own quiet strength. Those who observed her closely described a woman who was composed and steady, who did not lose herself in the role she had been given, who maintained, beneath the formality of her position, a clear and watchful sense of herself. The children continued to fill the household through this period. By the early 1770s, Charlotte had given birth to 8 or 9 of her 15 children. The nurseries were busy. The older children were beginning their education in earnest. The younger ones were still small and close. Charlotte oversaw a great deal of this herself. She was concerned with the details of their upbringing, what they read, how they spent their time, what values they were developing. George shared in this closely. He was, by the standards of royal fathers, unusually involved. He took an interest in his children's lessons and their characters. He wanted them to be good, in a genuine and simple sense. Not just accomplished or well-mannered, but morally serious. Charlotte and George were in agreement on this. Their household, for all its royal formality, had a certain domestic earnestness to it that set it apart from many European courts of the time. But the world beyond their household was not quiet. These were turbulent years in British political life. The relationship between Britain and its American colonies had been deteriorating for some time. Tensions over taxation, over representation, over the authority of Parliament were building steadily. Charlotte was not a political figure in any direct sense. Queens consort in this period did not hold political power or take public political positions. Her role was ceremonial and domestic, not governmental. But she was aware. She was observant. And the atmosphere of the era shaped the world she moved through. In 1775, armed conflict broke out in the American colonies. What began as scattered skirmishes became a full and serious war. George took this deeply to heart. He was a man who felt the weight of his duties intensely, and the loss of the colonies troubled him profoundly. Charlotte lived alongside that. She witnessed his distress. She navigated the household through it. The war went on for years. And then, in 1781, the British forces surrendered at Yorktown. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. The American colonies would become an independent nation. George was shattered by this. It represented in his mind a profound failure of duty. He was not an easy man to comfort in ordinary circumstances. In the face of this, he was deeply withdrawn and troubled. Charlotte continued in her role. She was present and steady. She did not have the means to fix what had been lost, and she did not try. She simply remained, as she had learned to remain through much of her life. It's worth pausing here for a moment, because Charlotte's life, when you look at it from the outside, can seem like a series of things that happened around her rather than to her. Wars, politics, illness, crises, events in which she had no formal role and no direct power. But to see it that way is to miss something. She was holding things together in the ways available to her. She was raising 15 children. She was managing an enormous household. She was maintaining the dignity and function of the royal family through years of difficulty. She was present, consistently and quietly, through all of it. That is its own kind of work, and it was real work. She also continued, through these years, to tend to her own inner life. Her interest in botany deepened. She was in close contact with the botanists who worked at Kew, and the gardens there continued to grow in ambition and scope under the encouragement she and George provided. She read, she played music, she maintained correspondence with people she respected and found interesting. She was not a woman who existed only in relation to the people around her. She had her own mind and her own quiet world. She moved through her duties. And then, in whatever spaces remained, she returned to the things that were hers. The 1780s brought more change. Charlotte was now in her 40s. Her older children were grown. The Prince of Wales, the future George IV, was in his 20s and already charting a very different course from his parents. He was extravagant where they were modest, pleasure-seeking where they were dutiful. He spent lavishly, behaved scandalously at times, and caused his father considerable pain. Charlotte's relationship with her eldest son was complicated. She loved him, as she loved all her children, but she did not always approve of him. And as he grew older and more independent, the distance between his world and hers became harder to ignore. Several of her other sons also caused difficulties as they came of age. The pressures of royal life and the strict upbringing George and Charlotte had imposed seemed to produce in some of the children a need to escape or rebel once they had the freedom to do so. Charlotte bore this quietly. She did not speak publicly about the troubles within her family. She maintained the outward composure that had always defined her. And then, in 1788, something happened that changed everything. George became seriously ill. The nature of his illness has been debated by historians and medical scholars for a long time. In his own time, it was frightening and mysterious. He became deeply confused. He spoke incessantly and sometimes incoherently. He was agitated and distressed. At times he did not seem to recognize those around him. Charlotte was, in those first terrible weeks, his closest witness. She was frightened. That much is clear from the accounts and letters that survive from this period. She had lived alongside George for 27 years by this point. She had built her entire life around their partnership, such as it was. And now he was unwell in a way that no one fully understood. The doctors of the era had limited means and limited understanding. They subjected George to treatments that were harsh and largely ineffective. Charlotte had to watch this too, to stand at some remove while her husband was treated in ways that must have been deeply distressing to witness. She was not, during this period, always able to see him as freely as she wished. The decisions around his care were taken by physicians and courtiers, and Charlotte's access to her husband was sometimes restricted. She found this difficult and painful. Publicly, the situation created a political crisis. If the king was incapacitated, who would govern? A Regency bill was debated in Parliament. The Prince of Wales stood ready to assume power. The whole question of the monarchy's stability hung in the air. And then, in the spring of 1789, George began to recover. It was not complete or guaranteed, but the worst of the episode passed. He returned to something closer to himself. The Regency bill was dropped. The crisis, for the moment, had passed. Charlotte must have felt an enormous relief. and perhaps also a kind of quiet dread, because she had seen now what could happen. She knew the illness had not vanished. It had only retreated. She adjusted her relationship with George carefully in the aftermath. There was a distance between them now, in some ways, that had not been there before. The illness had altered things. She had seen him vulnerable in a way that could not be unseen. And George, for his part, was not always easy to be close to, even in his better periods. But they continued, as they had always continued. Life at Windsor and Kew went on. The routines were maintained. The household kept its shape. And Charlotte, as she moved through her late 40s and toward her 50s, remained at its center. She was not a celebrated figure. Exactly. She was not beloved by the public in the way that some queens have been. She was not glamorous or dramatic. She did not inspire great passion or controversy. But she was respected. She was consistent. And she was, in a quiet way, the person who held a great deal together through some genuinely difficult years. She had arrived in England as a stranger. She had adapted, steadily and without fanfare, to everything that was asked of her. And there was more still to come. The 1790s brought new turbulence, this time from across the Channel. The French Revolution had erupted in 1789. The world of European monarchy was shaken. Kings and queens, aristocrats and courtiers looked on with a mixture of horror and anxiety as the old order in France collapsed. Charlotte was among those who felt this deeply. She was herself a daughter of that old order, a minor German noblewoman raised in the traditions of European aristocracy. The sight of the French monarchy destroyed, of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette executed, was not an abstract political event to her. It was a shattering of the world she had been born into. England itself was not in danger of revolution in the same way. But there was tension. There was fear. There was a heightened awareness among the ruling classes that nothing could be taken entirely for granted. Charlotte moved through these years with the same composure she had always shown. She did not speak publicly about her fears. She maintained her routines. She continued her patronage of music and botany. She attended to her household. But she was aging now, and the years ahead would be the hardest of all. As the 1790s continued, Charlotte's world grew quieter in some ways, and heavier in others. Her children were grown now, or nearly so. The younger ones were moving into adulthood. The older ones had their own households, their own concerns, their own complications. Some of those complications were significant. Several of her sons had entered into relationships or marriages that caused difficulty. The rules around royal marriages were strict. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 required members of the royal family to obtain the king's consent before marrying. Some of Charlotte's children tested those boundaries or moved around them in ways that created tension and sadness. Her son William, for example, had a long relationship with an actress named Dorothy Jordan. They lived together for many years and had children together. It was not a situation that could be openly celebrated within the royal family, though Dorothy Jordan was by many accounts a warm and capable person. Her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, had his own complicated marital history. He had secretly married a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert, a union that was not legally valid under the laws of the time. He then entered into an official marriage with Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795, a match that was deeply unhappy almost from the beginning. Charlotte watched all of this from a careful distance. She was not able to fix these situations. She was not always in a position to intervene, even when she might have wished to. And her relationships with her children were not always close enough for the kind of frank conversation that might have helped. She was fond of some of her children more than others. That is perhaps inevitable in a family of 15. She had particular affection for certain of her daughters, who remained close to home for much of their adult lives. Her daughters, in fact, had a difficult situation of their own. Several of them remained unmarried for a long time, or never married at all. This was partly circumstance, and partly the result of decisions made by their parents. George and Charlotte were not always eager to see their daughters leave. Finding suitable Protestant husbands of sufficient rank was genuinely difficult, and there was, perhaps, a tendency to keep the daughters close in a way that limited their independence. Charlotte's daughters sometimes felt the weight of this. Some of them expressed privately a sense of constraint and longing for lives beyond the royal household. They were capable and intelligent women. They had been given good educations, and yet their options were narrow. Charlotte was not entirely unsympathetic to this, but she was also a product of her time and her position. She had accepted her own constraints without public complaint. She may not have fully understood the cost her daughters paid. It is one of the more quietly difficult aspects of her story. She was, in many ways, a woman who adapted so completely to the demands placed upon her that she sometimes struggled to recognize those same demands as burdens in others. But she was not cold, not distant in any simple sense. Those who were close to her described a woman who could be warm and witty in private, who had a dry, observational sense of humor, who paid close attention to the people around her and remembered what mattered to them. She was formal in public because that was what was expected. In the smaller moments, she was more fully herself. She continued her music through this period. Her love of the keyboard never left her, and her botanical interests remained a source of genuine pleasure and intellectual engagement. She was also a patron in a meaningful sense. She supported artists and musicians and scholars in quiet, practical ways. She commissioned works. She provided introductions. She used the position she had been given to support the things she valued. The young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had visited London as a child decades earlier and had been received at court. Charlotte had been among those who heard him play. That encounter belongs to the early years of her queenship. By the time the 1790s arrived, Mozart was gone, having died in 1791. The world of music she had loved was changing. New composers, new styles. Charlotte moved with some of these changes and held others at a distance. But her commitment to music as something worth supporting and preserving remained steady. Outside the walls of her household, the world was increasingly unsettled. Britain was now at war with France. The Revolutionary Wars had drawn in much of Europe. The conflict was expensive, bloody, and uncertain. It reshaped trade, politics, and daily life across the country. For Charlotte, this meant a further tightening of the household. Extravagance was not appropriate in a time of national sacrifice. The royal family was expected to model restraint, and Charlotte had always been inclined that way in any case. She continued to manage a large and complex household with the same methodical attention she had always brought to it. She was, by all accounts, a capable and organized household manager. She kept careful accounts. She attended to details. She ensured that things ran as they should. This is easy to overlook, but it was real work. The royal household of this period was a large institution, with many staff, many moving parts, and many demands. Charlotte oversaw much of it directly. And then, as the decade turned and the new century began, George's health became a concern again. The illness that had struck in 1788 had never fully gone away. It had receded, but it had left something behind. And as George aged, his episodes of confusion and distress became more frequent and more prolonged. By the early years of the 19th century, it was becoming clear that this was not simply a passing difficulty. Something more lasting was happening. Charlotte adjusted to this reality, slowly and painfully. She continued to present a composed face to the world. The public face of the monarchy had to be maintained. George was the king. Any visible sign of serious incapacity would create political and constitutional difficulties. But in private, her life was changing. She was spending more time managing the situation around George's care, more time navigating the decisions made by the physicians and the courtiers, more time in a role that was less partnership and more guardianship. It is a hard thing to watch someone you have shared your life with become less themselves over time. Whatever the precise nature of their relationship, Charlotte had been with George for more than 40 years by this point. She had built her entire adult life in relation to his, and now he was slipping away in a particular and irreversible way. She did not write about this extensively, at least not in ways that have survived fully. She was not a woman who expressed her inner life openly on the page, but those around her noted that she seemed more tired, more burdened, more quietly heavy in those years. She was also in her 60s now. Her own health was not what it had been. She had always been physically resilient, but the decades of childbearing, of court life, of constant duty had taken their toll. She moved more slowly. She tired more easily. The long walks in the gardens at Kew became shorter. The evenings at the harpsichord, perhaps less frequent. But she did not stop. She continued to carry out her duties with the same steadiness she always had. She continued to support her patronages. She continued to attend the events that were expected of her. She continued to be present. There is something almost austere about this kind of perseverance, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply continues day after day, because continuing is what is required. Charlotte had always been that kind of person, and in these harder, later years, that quality became more visible, not because she displayed it, but because the circumstances drew it out. Around this time, she also became more involved in charitable work in a direct sense. She had always been charitable. She had given money to various causes over the years, in the quiet and unpublicized way that was typical of her. She was also associated with the lying-in hospital that would eventually bear her name, Queen Charlotte's Hospital, which still exists today in a different form, grew from an institution she supported for women in need of maternity care. This was genuinely important work. Maternal mortality was high in the 18th century, and the provision of proper care for women during and after childbirth was a matter of life and death. That Charlotte lent her name and support to this cause says something about where her attention rested in her later years. Less on the grandeur of royal life, and more on the quiet and practical needs of people who had little power of their own. It is a side of her that is easy to overlook. She is not remembered primarily as a philanthropist or a reformer, but the impulse was there. The concern was real. As the first decade of the 19th century continued, the situation with George grew steadily more serious. By 1810, it was becoming clear that he was not going to recover in any meaningful sense. His periods of confusion and distress had become permanent. He was living largely at Windsor, increasingly separated from public life and from his family. A regency was finally established in 1811. The Prince of Wales, Charlotte's eldest son, became Prince Regent. He would govern in his father's name for the rest of George's life. This was an enormous change. The man who had been king, who had been the centre around which Charlotte's entire adult life had turned, was no longer governing. He was present, but absent, alive, but unreachable. Charlotte continued in her role as queen. The title was hers regardless, but the practical meaning of her position shifted. The Prince Regent was now the most powerful figure in the royal family, and his relationship with his mother was respectful, but not always easy. They were different people in ways that had always created some distance. Charlotte moved through the Regency years with a kind of quiet displacement. She was still the queen. She was still received with the deference owed to that title. But the world had rearranged itself around her. She spent much of her time at Windsor, near George. Even though their contact was limited by his condition, she had not chosen to be distant from him. The circumstances had imposed that distance. She also spent time at Kew, in the gardens she loved, and at Frogmore, a house within the Windsor estate that had become a particular refuge for her. Frogmore was quieter and more private than the main castle. It had gardens that Charlotte had helped to shape. It felt perhaps more like her own space than many of the grand official residences she had occupied over the decades. She retreated there increasingly in these later years, and the end, though it was still a few years away, was beginning to make itself felt in the particular way that endings do. Not as a sudden thing, but as a slow and steady drawing inward. The years of the Regency settled into their own kind of rhythm. It was a different rhythm from the one Charlotte had known for most of her life. Slower in some ways, more removed from the center of things, but rhythm nonetheless. She was in her late 60s now. The world she moved through had changed enormously since that September day in 1761, when she had stepped off a ship and into a life she had not chosen. The Britain of the 1810s was not the Britain of her early queenship. The country had been transformed by decades of war, by the beginnings of industrialization, by the political upheavals that had reshaped Europe. Cities were growing. The old certainties of the agrarian world were giving way to something newer and louder and harder to understand. Charlotte observed all of this from a distance. She was not a woman who engaged publicly with political questions. She never had been, but she was aware. She read. She paid attention, and she watched the world changing around her with the watchful steadiness that had always characterized her. Her family continued to occupy much of her attention and her concern. The question of royal succession had become pressing in these years. Several of her sons were married, but the legitimate royal grandchildren were few. Her son Edward, the Duke of Kent, would eventually father a daughter who would one day become Queen Victoria. But that was still in the future. In Charlotte's lifetime, the succession was a source of uncertainty and quiet anxiety. Her granddaughter, Princess Charlotte of Wales, was the most prominent figure in the next generation. She was the daughter of the Prince Regent and his estranged wife, Princess Caroline. She was young, spirited, and popular with the public in a way that her grandfather and grandmother had never quite been. Queen Charlotte had a genuine affection for her granddaughter. The young Princess Charlotte was lively and warm, and she seems to have brought something lighter into the older woman's quieter world. In 1816, Princess Charlotte married Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. It was a love match, or something close to one. The public celebrated it warmly. There was real hope attached to the young couple. Hope for the future. Hope for the continuation of the dynasty in a way that felt genuinely promising. Queen Charlotte attended the wedding. She was 72 years old. She had attended so many ceremonies over the course of her life. So many occasions of state and family and ritual. This one must have felt different. Younger, more forward-looking. She could not have known then what was coming. In November of 1817, Princess Charlotte died. She had been pregnant, and the birth was long and difficult. The baby, a son, was stillborn, and then Princess Charlotte herself died in the hours that followed. It was a devastating loss. For the country, it was a shock and a grief that spread widely and genuinely. Princess Charlotte had been beloved. Her death felt sudden and wrong and terribly sad. For Queen Charlotte, it was a blow of a particular kind. She had lived long enough to see so much loss. She had watched her husband disappear into illness. She had navigated the difficulties of her children's lives for decades. And now, here was this bright young granddaughter, gone at 21. She did not have long to grieve, because Queen Charlotte's own health, which had been declining for some time, began to fail more seriously in 1818. She had been suffering from dropsy, which is the old term for what we would now call edema. Fluid had been accumulating in her body. She had grown increasingly weak and uncomfortable. The illness had been advancing slowly, and by the middle of 1818, it was clear that she was not going to recover. She faced this with the composure she had always brought to difficulty. She continued to receive visitors when she was able. She continued to attend to correspondence. She continued to maintain the dignified outward face that had defined her public life for 50 years. But she was tired, deeply and genuinely tired, in the way that a long life approaching its end produces. She had been queen for 57 years. She had borne 15 children. She had managed an enormous household through decades of personal and political difficulty. She had watched her husband lose himself to illness. She had outlived grandchildren. The tiredness was earned. In the autumn of 1818, she began to make her final arrangements. She spent time at Kew. Then she was moved to Kew Palace, the small Dutch-style house within the gardens that she and George had used for many years. It was a quieter, more intimate setting than Windsor or Buckingham House. It suited the final weeks. Her children gathered around her as best they could. The Prince Regent came. Other sons and daughters came. There were long, quiet hours in the small rooms of Kew Palace, with the gardens outside and the Thames not far away. She died on the 17th of November, 1818. She was 74 years old. She had been Queen of Great Britain and Ireland for 57 years. The Prince Regent was at her side when she died. He held her hand. She was buried at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. It was a quiet ceremony, as she might have wished. Not extravagant, not theatrical, dignified and respectful. George, her husband, was still alive. He was at Windsor, separated from the world by his illness, and it is not entirely clear how much he understood of what had happened. He would survive her by a little over a year, dying in January of 1820. They were buried in the same chapel. After more than 50 years of marriage, they came to rest in the same place. In the weeks and months after Charlotte's death, the public response was respectful and measured. She had not been a figure who inspired passionate devotion or dramatic mourning. That had never been her way, and it was not how she was mourned. But there was genuine respect, a recognition of the long decades of service she had rendered, a quiet acknowledgement of everything she had held together. The newspapers of the time noted her steadiness, her dignity, her devotion to duty. They noted her love of music and botany. They noted the 15 children she had raised. They noted the 57 years she had spent as queen. They noted too that she had borne a great deal, and had borne it without complaint. That was perhaps the truest summary anyone could offer. She had borne a great deal, and she had borne it without complaint. In the years that followed, her memory settled into the background of British history in the way that quiet figures often do. She was not forgotten, but she was not celebrated loudly. There were no great monuments erected in her honor, no dramatic paintings of her heroic moments. She had not had heroic moments in the conventional sense. What she had had was something harder to paint or sculpt, a life of sustained, unglamorous, deeply human effort, a life of adaptation and endurance, a life lived mostly in service to roles and responsibilities she had not chosen and could not escape. But legacies take different forms. Her name lives on in Queen Charlotte's Hospital, that institution for women in need of maternity care that she had supported in her later years. Countless women over the generations since her death have been cared for in an institution that carries her name. That is a quiet and meaningful legacy. Practical, human, exactly in keeping with the kind of person she was. Her name lives on in the Strelitzia, the bird of paradise flower, that bright and striking bloom named for the duchy she came from. Every time someone encounters that vivid flower, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz is there in a small way, present in the natural world she loved so much. The gardens at Kew, which she and George had helped to develop and expand over their long years at the palace nearby, became one of the great botanical gardens of the world. The Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew are visited by millions of people every year. They are a place of beauty and science and wonder. Charlotte's quiet passion for botany is woven into their history. And then there is a more recent kind of legacy. In the 21st century, Charlotte became a more widely discussed figure when questions were raised about her ancestry and background. Some historians and researchers have suggested that Charlotte may have had African ancestry through a Portuguese royal line, and that she may therefore have been the first mixed-race queen of Britain. This is a question that historians continue to discuss and examine. The evidence is complex and debated. It cannot be resolved with simple certainty. But the conversation itself brought Charlotte back into public attention in a new way. A woman who had spent centuries in the quiet background of history suddenly became a figure of contemporary interest and significance. The popular television series Bridgerton and its prequel series Queen Charlotte drew on this discussion to create a fictional portrait of her early life. Many people who had never heard of Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz encountered her name and her story for the first time through that dramatization. History works in unexpected ways. Sometimes a figure who lived quietly and was mourned quietly finds a new kind of attention centuries after their death. Sometimes the questions we ask in our own time illuminate someone from the past in ways that were not possible before. Charlotte's story, seen through contemporary eyes, carries meanings it may not have carried in her own time. A young woman brought from a small and modest home to a large and demanding one. A foreigner who spent her whole life adapting to a country that was never entirely her own. A person of possible mixed heritage, navigating one of the most scrutinized positions in the world. A mother of 15, a keeper of a household through crisis after crisis. A lover of music and flowers and quiet gardens. All of these things were true at once. None of them cancels out the others. She was complex, as people are. She was shaped by her time, as people are. She had limitations that were hers, and limitations that were imposed upon her. But she was also, underneath all of it, a person. A real and specific person who had lived a long and genuinely remarkable life. The small Dutch house at Kew where she died still stands. Kew Palace, as it is known, is open to visitors. You can walk through the rooms where Charlotte spent her final weeks. You can stand in the garden outside and look at the Thames in the distance. It is a modest place for a queen, but modesty suited her. She had never asked for grandeur. She had asked for very little, in truth. She had simply lived the life that came to her, and she had lived it with as much steadiness and grace as she could manage. That is not nothing. In fact, for most of us, it is everything. Let's return to Charlotte for a little while longer, because there are parts of her story that deserve more time. Quieter parts, the parts that don't appear in the broad outlines of history, but that give a life its texture and its feeling. We've moved through the main shape of her years. The arrival in England, the marriage, the children, the long decades of duty, the illness of her husband, the slow fading at the end. But within all of that, there was a daily life. A life made of mornings and evenings and ordinary hours. And it's worth spending some time there. Charlotte's days, for much of her adult life, followed a careful structure. She rose early. That was a habit she maintained consistently. The royal household ran on schedule, and Charlotte was not a person who resisted routine. She seems to have found comfort in it. The predictability of a well-ordered day suited her temperament. Her mornings typically began with her toilette. This was not simply a matter of washing and dressing. For a queen in the Georgian era, the morning toilette was a ceremony in itself. Ladies in waiting attended her. There were rituals of grooming and preparation that took time and care. Charlotte was not vain in any excessive sense, but she was always careful about her appearance. She understood that the way she presented herself was part of the role she had to play. After her morning preparations, there were often audiences, people seeking to be received by the Queen, courtiers paying their respects, officials conducting necessary business. Charlotte moved through these interactions with the formal grace that had become second nature to her over the decades. She was not a warm public presence in the way that some monarchs have been. She did not project an easy charm or a natural ease with strangers. She was correct and dignified and composed. People respected her. They did not always feel immediately at ease with her, but those who spent real time with her told a different story. In private, she was more relaxed, more willing to speak her mind. She had opinions. She was interested in ideas. She asked questions. She listened carefully to the answers. She had a particular gift, those close to her noted, for remembering the details of people's lives. She would ask after a lady-in-waiting's sick mother. She would recall a conversation from months before and return to it. She paid attention in a genuine and sustained way. This is a form of kindness that is easy to underestimate. The kindness of attention, of being truly seen and remembered by someone who has no particular obligation to remember you. Charlotte offered that, quietly and consistently. Her afternoons, when court duties allowed, were often given over to her personal interests. She spent time in the gardens at Kew, with a regularity and a seriousness that went beyond casual enjoyment. She was genuinely knowledgeable about plants. She could identify species. She understood their properties and their histories. She engaged with the botanists who worked at Kew on their own terms, as someone who knew what she was talking about. She collected botanical illustrations. She had an interest in the formal documentation of plant species that was very much in keeping with the scientific spirit of her era. The 18th century was a great age of natural history. People like Carl Linnaeus were bringing order and system to the natural world. Charlotte was part of that broader cultural enthusiasm for understanding and cataloguing nature. Her collection of botanical drawings was extensive and carefully maintained. It represented years of patient accumulation. It was a serious collection, not a decorative one. She also spent time at her keyboard in the afternoons when she could. The harpsichord had been her instrument from childhood. Later, she also played the fortepiano, the instrument that was gradually replacing the harpsichord in fashionable musical circles in the latter half of the 18th century. She played well, not as a performer in any public sense, but as a genuine musician who played for the love of it. She is said to have been able to sight read competently and to have had a good musical memory. She could reproduce pieces she had heard. She could work her way through new music and find her way into it. Music for Charlotte was a private language, a place she could go that belonged entirely to herself. However crowded or demanding or difficult her days became, there was always the possibility of sitting down at the keyboard and disappearing into sound for a while. That is worth something. That is worth a great deal, actually. She also read. She was a consistent and serious reader throughout her life. Her library at Windsor was substantial. She read in German, which was her first language, and in French, which she had learned as a child. She read in English, though that came later. and perhaps never felt as natural as the other two. She read history and natural philosophy, and correspondence and literature. She kept up with the intellectual currents of her time without being in any way an intellectual celebrity. She was interested in ideas as a private matter, not as a performance. There is a word in German, Bildung, that refers to the process of self-cultivation and formation through learning and experience. It was an idea that was gaining cultural importance in German intellectual life during Charlotte's lifetime. Whether she used the word herself or thought in those terms, the concept fits her. She was a person who took her own formation seriously, who believed that the mind should be tended and developed, not left idle. She passed this on to her children as best she could. The education she and George provided for their children was thorough and demanding by the standards of the time. Languages, music, history, mathematics, geography. The children were expected to take their lessons seriously. Some of them did. Some of them resisted, as children do. But the intention behind their education was genuine. Charlotte believed in learning as something of real value, not just as a social accomplishment, but as a way of being more fully alive to the world. Her evenings, when they were not taken up by formal court events, were often spent with a small circle of family or close companions. George, in the earlier years of their marriage, was typically present. They would read or play music or simply sit together in the quiet way of people who have known each other for a long time. In the later years, when George's illness had changed things, those evenings became different, quieter in a lonelier way. Charlotte might sit with one or two of her daughters. She might read alone. She might play a little at the keyboard. The shape was the same, but what it contained had changed. She also spent time on her correspondence in the evenings. She wrote letters regularly and took the task seriously. She maintained connections through letters with people she could not see in person. Family members in Germany, scholars and artists she had supported, old friends from the earlier decades of her life. Her letters, when they have survived, reveal a person who was thoughtful and precise in her expression, who chose her words carefully, who was capable of both warmth and dry humor when the occasion allowed. She did not write for posterity, as far as we can tell. She wrote to communicate. Her letters were practical and personal, not composed for an audience beyond their recipient, but they give us glimpses of a person that the formal portraits and official histories tend to miss. The woman who enjoyed a piece of gossip relayed by a trusted friend. The woman who expressed genuine worry about a child's health in a tone quite different from her composed public manner. The woman who wrote about a new plant she had acquired for her collection with the quiet enthusiasm of someone who has found something genuinely pleasing. These glimpses matter. They remind us that history is made of people, real people, with real inner lives and real small pleasures and real private worries, and that even the most formal and ceremonially defined existence contains, somewhere inside it, a human being who wakes up in the morning and moves through their day one moment at a time. Charlotte moved through 60 years of mornings and afternoons and evenings as queen. 60 years of all the ordinary hours that make up a life. That is a long time to maintain a role, a long time to appear composed when you are frightened, A long time to keep showing up for ceremonies and audiences and public occasions that demand your presence, regardless of how you feel. She did it consistently and without the kind of public recognition that might have made it easier. Because the other thing worth saying about Charlotte is that she was not celebrated in the way that some historical figures are. She was not a warrior queen. She was not a tragic romantic figure. She was not a reformer or a visionary. She did not make great speeches or lead great movements. She was a woman who did what was asked of her for a very long time and did it with integrity and care. Our culture has not always known what to do with that kind of life. We tend to celebrate the dramatic and the transformative, the lives that changed everything, that broke through barriers, that left unmistakable marks on the visible surface of history. Charlotte's marks are quieter. They are in the hospital that bears her name, in the flower named for her duchy, in the gardens she helped to nurture at Kew, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried her bloodline forward through the 19th century and beyond. They are in the fact that she held herself together, and by extension, held a great deal else together, through some genuinely difficult years, through war and political crisis, and her husband's illness, and the losses that accumulated in her later life. That kind of holding together does not make headlines. It does not inspire monuments, but it is real, and it matters. There is something in Charlotte's story that speaks to a kind of experience that many people will recognize. Not the experience of royalty, obviously. Not the specific pressures of being a queen in the Georgian era, but the experience of adapting to a life you did not entirely choose, of finding your footing in unfamiliar ground, of maintaining yourself through circumstances that are often beyond your control, of discovering, in the ordinary details of daily life, the things that sustain you: music, gardens, the pleasure of a well-tended collection, the small warmth of a remembered conversation. These were Charlotte's sustaining things, and they sustained her through a very long and genuinely demanding life. She had come to England at 17, frightened and seasick, speaking little English, knowing no one. She had died at 74, in the small Dutch house at Kew, surrounded by the gardens she loved and the children she had raised. Between those two moments was a lifetime of quiet effort, and that lifetime is worth remembering. There is one more part of Charlotte's story that deserves careful attention, and that is the world she lived in. Not just her personal world, not just the household and the gardens and the keyboard in the quiet room, but the larger world, the Britain of her time. Because Charlotte arrived in England at a particular moment, a moment when the country was changing in ways that would shape everything that came after. The Britain of 1761 was a country on the edge of enormous transformation. The Industrial Revolution was beginning, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow and gathering way that real change tends to happen. Mills were being built. Machines were beginning to do work that hands had always done. Cities were starting to grow in ways they never had before. Charlotte was not directly involved in any of this. She was not an industrial figure. She was not an economic reformer. The world of mills and machinery and the emerging working class was distant from the world she inhabited, but it was happening all around her. And over the course of her 57 years as queen, the country changed beyond recognition. The Britain of 1818, the year she died, was a different place from the Britain of 1761. Larger, louder, more crowded in its cities, more connected by roads and canals, more industrially powerful, and more socially complicated. Charlotte witnessed this transformation across her lifetime without being at its center. She was a figure of the old order, of the world of courts and ceremonies and carefully maintained hierarchy. And that old order was not disappearing exactly, but it was being joined by something new and much harder to control. The tension between the old world and the new one was one of the defining tensions of the Georgian era. And Charlotte lived through all of it. She also lived through the era of slavery and its beginnings of abolition. This is an important and uncomfortable part of the world she inhabited. Britain in the 18th century was deeply entangled with the slave trade. The wealth of many of the country's most powerful families was connected, directly or indirectly, to slavery. The empire was expanding. The trade in human beings was at its height in the earlier decades of Charlotte's queenship. The movement to abolish the slave trade was also growing during her lifetime. Figures like William Wilberforce were making the moral case with increasing power and increasing public effect. In 1807, the slave trade was abolished within the British Empire, though slavery itself continued in British territories until 1833, after Charlotte's death. Charlotte was not an abolitionist in any active or public sense. She was not a political figure, and abolition was a deeply political question. But the world in which she lived was shaped by these realities, and her court and her household were part of a system that benefited from the wider imperial economy. This is part of an honest account of her life, not to condemn her as an individual, but to place her accurately in the world she inhabited. She was a person of her time, and her time contained things that we now recognize as profoundly wrong. The question of Charlotte's own ancestry, which we touched on earlier, adds a layer of particular complexity to this. If Charlotte did indeed have African ancestry, as some historians have argued, then she occupied a position of extraordinary irony. A woman of partial African heritage, sitting at the very apex of a society built in part on the exploitation of African people, moving through the rituals and ceremonies of a court whose empire was sustained by slavery. We cannot know exactly what Charlotte understood or felt about any of this. The evidence does not reach that far into her inner life, but the situation itself is worth sitting with. It speaks to the complexity of history, to the way that individual lives and large historical forces are always tangled together in ways that resist simple summary. Charlotte was a person. She was also a symbol. She was also a part of a system. All of those things were true at once, and all of them belonged to an honest telling of her story. The Britain she lived in was also a country of enormous cultural vitality. The 18th century was a great age of British literature, philosophy, and art. Samuel Johnson was working. Jane Austen was born and grew up and wrote her novels during Charlotte's lifetime. Joshua Reynolds and Thomas Gainsborough were painting. The great country houses were being built and filled with art and furniture, and the physical expressions of wealth and taste. Charlotte was connected to this cultural world in various ways. She sat for portraits by the leading painters of the day, She was a patron of music and botanical illustration. Her court was not the most artistically adventurous in Europe, but it was not indifferent to culture. She also sat for Johann Zoffany, one of the great portrait painters of the Georgian era. His paintings of Charlotte and her family give us some of our most intimate visual records of domestic royal life in this period. Not the grand ceremonial portraits, but quieter images. Charlotte at the harpsichord. Charlotte with her children gathered around her. Charlotte in the gardens. These images are worth seeking out if you have the chance. They show a woman who looks, in the quieter moments, quite simply, like a person. Not a symbol or a monument or a figure of state. Just a person in a room with the people she loves nearby. There is one painting in particular, by Zoffany, of Charlotte, with her two eldest sons when they were young children. She is seated. The children are close. The atmosphere is domestic and warm. It is not a formal portrait in any grand sense. It is a mother with her children, and it reminds you, as these things do, that even the most defined and ceremonially encased lives contain within them something entirely ordinary, entirely human. Charlotte was human in all the ways that matter. She was afraid sometimes. She was lonely sometimes. She was proud, and she was patient, and she was occasionally frustrated. And she was, beneath all the formality, simply trying to live her life as well as she could manage. That is what most of us are doing, in our different circumstances and our different worlds. And perhaps that is one reason why her story, looked at carefully and slowly, continues to hold something worth finding. She was not a perfect person. No person is. She had the limitations of her class and her era. She was formal in ways that created distance. She was perhaps too accepting of constraints that caused her children pain. She was a participant in a world that contained deep injustice, as all of us are participants in worlds that contain injustice. But she was also genuinely good in many of the ways that matter most. She was faithful to the people she was responsible for. She was honest in her dealings. She was kind in the specific and attentive way that can make a real difference to real people. She supported work that helped women in need. She loved the natural world and helped preserve and extend one of the great gardens of the world. She showed up day after day, decade after decade. She showed up. There is a particular kind of courage in that. Not the dramatic courage of the battlefield or the parliament, but the quiet courage of continuing, of carrying on through difficulty and loss and the long accumulation of ordinary hardship. Charlotte had that courage in abundance. And as we move toward the end of her story, it feels right to sit with that for a moment, to think about what it means to live a long life with integrity, to maintain yourself through change and loss, to find the small things that sustain you and to tend them carefully, to show kindness in the particular and attentive ways that are within your reach. Charlotte did all of those things. She showed up for 57 years. She tended her gardens and her music and her correspondence. She paid attention to the people around her. She bore what she had to bear without making it someone else's burden. And at the end, she died in a quiet house, by a garden she loved, with her children nearby. That is not a small life. That is, in many ways, a very full one. Her name is still with us, in the hospital, in the flower, in the gardens at Kew, in the paintings of Zoffany, that show a mother sitting with her children in a warm room, and in the conversations that continue to happen about who she was and what her life might mean. Those conversations are a form of life too, a kind of continuing presence in the world. Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, born in a small and quiet duchy in northern Germany, married to a king she had never met on the day she arrived in his country. Queen for 57 years, mother of 15, lover of music and gardens, and the careful documentation of the natural world, a person who adapted and persisted and endured, a person who held a great deal together for a very long time, a person worth spending a quiet evening with. And now, as the story settles and the night grows later, let that image rest with you. The small house at Kew, the gardens outside, the sound of water somewhere not far away, the warmth of a room where someone lived with care and patience, and a quiet love for the beautiful things the world contains. Let that be enough for tonight, and so we come gently to the end of Charlotte's story, and the end of this quiet evening together. It has been a long life to walk through, a life that began in a small and modest duchy in northern Germany in the spring of 1744, a life that unfolded across more than 7 decades through one of the most turbulent and transformative periods in British history. And yet, for all the turbulence of the world around her, Charlotte's life had a quality of steadiness to it, a quality of continuing. She arrived as a stranger. She became a queen. She raised a family. She tended her gardens. She played her music. She paid attention to the people around her. She bore what needed to be borne. And then, quietly, she let go. That is the shape of it. Not a dramatic arc. Not a story of conquest or reinvention or sudden transformation. Just a life, lived carefully and fully, across a long stretch of time. There is something peaceful in that, if you let yourself feel it. The world Charlotte moved through is gone now. The court ceremonies and the candlelit rooms and the formal gardens laid out in the 18th century style. The harpsichords and the botanical collections and the careful rituals of the morning toilette. All of that belongs to another world entirely. And yet, something remains. The flower named for her duchy still blooms. The gardens at Kew still open their gates every morning to people who come to walk among the trees and the plants and the quiet green spaces she helped to nurture. The hospital that bears her name has cared for women and families across many generations. These are quiet remainders, gentle ones, the kind that suit her. She never sought grand monuments. She never asked to be remembered in a loud or insistent way. She simply lived her life with as much care and integrity as she could manage, for as long as she was given. And that, in the end, is all any of us can do. As you lie here tonight, in the quiet of your own space, perhaps that is something worth carrying with you into sleep. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic moments, but the small and steady things. The music played in a quiet room, the garden tended with patience and love, the attention given to someone who needed to feel seen. These things last. They last longer than the ceremonies and the titles and the formal portraits. They last in the way that quiet things last. Gently, persistently, without announcing themselves. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz understood that, I think. She lived it every day. And now her story rests. As you can rest too. Let the images settle softly. The small house at Kew. The gardens outside. the pale winter light coming through the window, the sound of a keyboard being played somewhere inside, the smell of something green and living nearby, a woman sitting quietly with the life she was given, at peace with it, in the end, at peace. Let your breathing slow a little now. Let the thoughts become softer and less defined. Let the story fade gently, the way a candle fades when the room is already dark enough to sleep. You've spent this evening with a remarkable woman, someone who lived with steadiness and care through a long and genuinely demanding life. That is enough to carry with you. That is more than enough. Thank you for spending this time here at Bedtime Biographies. Rest well tonight. The world will still be there in the morning. But for now, there is only this: the quiet, the dark, the slow and easy rhythm of your own breathing. Sleep well.